Tipping is easy, actually. Tipping is a conspiracy that forces you to do math in your head. Tipping is also how you show appreciation for good service, how you show your friends that you're better than them, and it's how you bribe strangers to like you. But tipping is only a thing in the great US of A and Canada, which isn't actually a real country. Canada is a made-up place that only exists so that all the fake girlfriends American men pretend they're dating can have somewhere to live. In the 193 countries of the world that are too pathetic to be number one in school shootings, tipping is rare and completely optional because service workers get these fancy things from their employers. They're called salaries and benefits. Americans, however, are simple folk. They don't believe in all that fancy schmancy nonsense. Salaries and benefits are reserved for people who have real jobs. You know, consultants. Americans who do so-called essential work, instead of just getting a fat salary to consult consultants on how to consult, are usually paid by the hour. The pay is peanuts, but for legal reasons, you have to call them dollars. The government has laws to ensure that all working Americans earn just enough dollars to go broke after paying their rent. The figure the federal government settled on is $7.25 an hour. This is the minimum wage for everyone except for bartenders, waiters, valets, and anyone who receives more than $30 a month in tips. Once the tips reach $31, an employer can legally pay $2.13 an hour under federal law instead of $7.25. This is why service workers need tips. Without tips, they would starve. And the people who would suffer the most are their landlords. It's brutal when you can't install a hot tub in your beach house because Sean dropped a plate of ribs last week. Supporters of tipping argue that tips motivate service workers to work harder and provide better service to customers. What they don't say is that by making them completely reliant on tips, establishments like bars, restaurants, and hotels force their employees to always be extra nice to customers, however insufferable those customers are. Despite all this forced niceness, tipping is still optional in America. You can tip 20%, 15%, or 0%. It all depends on how much you want the waiter to spit in your food. Everything is not as horrible as it might sound though. If a service worker fails to earn enough in tips to cover the spread between the tipped minimum wage and the legal minimum wage, the employer has to pay the worker the difference. So, if Sean is a tipped waiter who only makes $2.87 an hour in tips on top of the $2.13 minimum wage, his earnings would be $5 per hour. Because this is below the federal minimum wage, Sean's boss would have to pay him an extra $2.25 to bring the earnings up to $7.25. Remember, $7.25 is the federal minimum wage. State minimum wages can be a lot higher. That $2.25 that Sean's boss pays him is known as the tip credit. Officially, the tip credit creates a guarantee that service workers can earn at least a minimum wage. But unofficially, there is always a possibility that instead of paying the tip credit, Sean's boss could just fire Sean and replace him with someone who makes enough in tips so the boss doesn't have to pay anything. This, of course, a conspiracy theory. The business world is filled with saints who would never fire an employee to save a few bucks. Oh wait. And if Sean's boss is the kind of guy who would fire an employee to avoid paying a tip credit, what are the odds that Sean would lie about how much money he's making in tips just to avoid getting fired? That's where you come in. Business owners want you to tip their employees so they don't have to pay them. The employees want you to tip them because they need the money, but you don't want to tip because you also need the money. So what do? You tip them anyway because you're weak. You're scared the co-check attendant you'll never meet again won't like you if you don't tip. But here is the most interesting thing. The attendant won't like you if you tip either. By tipping her, you're doing exactly what is expected of you. She'll say thanks and smile. Then you'll go about your day, dreaming of all the kids you'll have, while she smiles at another guy giving her another tip. Even when you decide to tip, there's a whole question of how much. How much do you tip a co-check attendant? How about a valet? Or a Twitch streamer with big milkers? What about one with smaller milkers? Does she get less? What about a dude? Does he get anything? What I'm trying to say is that tipping is more complicated than an Alabama family tree. In bars and restaurants, tipping is mostly settled. 20% of the bill if the service was good, 15% if the service was mid, and if the service was terrible, you have to tip 18% because those places put a mandatory gratuity on the bill anyway. The only way to avoid a restaurant tip is to literally get poisoned. Your bill for the 2-minute ambulance ride will give you a heart attack and kill you before anybody can demand a tip. But even in restaurants, there are certain situations where tips can feel a little excessive. You could order a bottle of wine that costs $20 or one that costs $2,000. The waiter doesn't need to work any harder lifting or pouring any of the wines. It's the exact same amount of work. Because you're tipping as a percentage, At 20%, you're paying a $4 tip on the $20 bottle of wine. On the $2,000 bottle, a 20% tip comes to $400. I don't know about you, but I smell communism. That $400 feels suspiciously like a wealth tax. This is America. It's illegal for the rich to pay taxes. Outside of restaurants, however, it gets very complicated. How much do you tip a barber? At a $30 place, 20% of that is only $6. But what if it's one of those places with $500 haircuts? Do you still tip? A $500 haircut is already a robbery. Does the barber need to add an idiot tax on top of that? Then comes the valet. Do you tip at drop-off or pickup? What if you tip a valet at drop-off, but find a different valet on duty when you return? Do you tip the new valet? Nobody seems to know the answers to these questions. Even so-called etiquette experts can't agree. That's probably because etiquette expert is a fake job that a scarf-wearing snob makes up to avoid confronting the fact that he has failed at life. But etiquette experts say it's bad etiquette to question the qualifications of etiquette experts. And without etiquette experts to guide them, Americans appear to tip someone whenever they feel guilty. This guilt never disappears. Past a certain point, you realize you're just bribing strangers to like you. Even then, likability isn't always guaranteed. Sometimes you tip the waitress 50% because you think she likes you, but when you ask her out so you can give her your tip, she tells you that she only likes you as a customer. Even worse, you can't reduce your tip the next time you eat at that restaurant because you will look like a loser who only tips waitresses so they can go out with him. I mean, you may be that, but you don't want to look like you are. So you keep tipping 50% until you catch a cold. You go to the hospital and discover you can't afford the cough syrup because it cost $873,000, and you already sold your kidney to pay a bill the last time you were in the hospital. So you do what any red-blooded American would do in a situation like that. You die. And even as you get dissected in a medical school anatomy class because your family couldn't afford a funeral, there's only one thought in your mind. Worth it. Nobody thinks you're a bad person because you always tipped everybody, and that's what tipping is all about.